Thanks, Josh. We want to say welcome if you're joining us online as well. We have some virtual guests, and we just want to say thank you for joining us. So when I was preparing for this class, one thing that I always had in the back of my mind, it's interesting to think of James being Jesus' brother. So when we look at the other times we read about James, one thing that I always thought was kind of interesting is you don't really read about James being present during the crucifixion. And you don't really read about James interacting throughout Jesus' life, except for maybe one time in Mark chapter 7, when it talks about how his brothers didn't believe in him. So you kind of, in the back of my mind when I'm studying James, we have, this member of the church now who grew up so close to Jesus, his brother, for let's say roughly 30 years, not believing in him. And then we think that the book of James was written in about 65 AD. So now he's an old man. He's 60 years old, and now he's sitting down to write about my time with Christ. So I just always thought that was kind of interesting, thinking about if you are 60 years old, thinking back on your life, what are the lessons that you have learned being with Christ? So that's kind of how I was, I just always kept that in the back of my mind. So this morning, we are going to be going over James chapter 1, verses 9 through 27. So it's a lot of material for us to look at. If you just go ahead and open up and just look at a high level of James chapter 1, it looks, James is almost jumping around all over the place. So he starts off and he says, the first section, James chapter 1, verse 2, he's talking about trials. And then he spends a little bit time talking about wisdom. And then he goes into money, and then temptation, and then attitude, and then having good gifts. And then he talks about being a doer and not just a hearer. And then he talks about being slow to speak. And so James is covering a ton of material in chapter 1. And I know that we could probably, each section, have a full sermon on that. So we're going to be talking at a high level, but I think I encourage you all to open up and communicate about what you all find as practical advice, because really James is here to teach us how to live a practical life of Christianity. So James chapter 1, verses 9 through 11. Let the brother of low degree rejoice in that he is exalted, but the rich rejoice in that he is made low. Because as the flower of the grass he shall pass away, for the sun rises with its scorching heat and withers the grass, its flower falls, and its beauty perishes, so also will the rich man fade away in the midst of his pursuits. So one thing that I think is interesting about this scripture is it seems to be two extremes. He says, let the rich man, so you either are rich or you either are poor. And to me, that just seems a little bit, it's hard. Because if I was to go around the room and ask each one of you, are you rich or are you poor? Are you rich or are you poor? Those are your only two options. I think most of us, at least me, be like, well, I can always find someone that's more rich than me, and I can usually always find someone that's poorer than me. And so if I was going to look at my own life, I'd put myself in the middle. And would you all do the same? I mean, if I asked all of you, are you rich or are you poor? What would you say? Yeah, exactly. Define rich, and he doesn't do it. And so, you could say if you're in America, if we look globally, just being in America, everyone is rich. Like you want to talk about poor, you need to go to third world countries where they are struggling to feed their children. And so you could take one attitude, it's like everybody is rich because we have clothes on our backs and we have food in the fridge. And so what he says to me is, everyone has to pick one. You're either rich, and if you're rich, you need to focus on being humble, knowing that all the gifts that you have come from God. And if you're poor, don't worry about being poor. Don't worry about being poor. You need to take rejoice that you have been exalted. So what does that mean? Rejoice that you have been exalted. That's right. Yep. So if you're poor, rejoice that you have Christ. And if you're rich, you can't be focused on that being important. You got to be focused on being a humble servant of Christ. So one question I have, so if we look in Proverbs chapter 30, is this conflicting to Proverbs chapter 30? Proverbs chapter 30 says, 2 things I ask of you, Lord. Do not refuse me before I die. Keep falsehood and lies far from me. Give me neither poverty nor riches, but give me only the daily bread. Otherwise, I may have too much and disown you and say, who is the Lord? Or I may become poor and steal and dishonor the name of God. So James is kind of saying you're either rich or poor, and Proverbs says I don't want either. So is that conflicting in any way? Good. Thank you. Anybody else? All right. Moving on to verse 12. Verse 12. Blessed is a man who perseveres under trial. For once he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life which the Lord has promised to those who love him. So how many of us are going to go through trials? Is it just based on if you're rich or if you're poor? It's everyone. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, so both the rich and the poor, they will both face different trials, and they both must endure those trials individually. So this also mimics exactly what Jesus said on the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are those who have been persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you and persecute you falsely and say all kinds of things and evil things against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward in heaven is great. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. So what are we to learn in verse 12? Blessed is the man who perseveres under trial. Okay. Yep. So Josh says you will persevere under trial, and those trials are not in vain. So thank you. Scott? Something better is coming down the road. There's a crown of life that is coming down the road. So, do not give up. Absolutely. Temptations make us stronger. Yes. Yep. Keep enduring. There's something better coming. The trials are going to come. They're going to beat you down, but keep enduring. The crown of life is coming. Okay, why not? So, your first point was I don't believe everybody endures trials. Do not endure trials. So, I would disagree only to the point that the Bible says that if you are a follower of Christ, you will go through these. You will be persecuted. And so if you're not going through trials, then you're probably not following Christ. Yeah. Yeah, I would yeah. So is there a difference between temptation and trials? So what's the difference? What's the difference between a temptation and a trial? Yep. And I agree. I agree that there is a distinction. So one of the things that, in my mind, I distinct between a trial and a temptation is a trial feels more external to me. So I am going through some type of persecution. I'm going through some type of action. And a temptation is in my mind, that I am fighting against the opportunity and the desire. And in my mind, I'm fighting against that temptation. But the trial is the actual action of persecution or an external force. Okay, thank you. Um, so for those online, Steve said, whenever you come across a temptation, instead of focus on fighting that temptation, focus on God's word and turning your attention to God, and that will help in turn move yourself away from that temptation. I summarized that quickly. All right, good enough. Thank you. Any comments on verse 12? Thank you. Yep. Thank you. Um, Thank you. This is wonderful. Anything else? Yeah. Yeah. Because endurance takes a certain level of mental toughness. But when we became Christians, it's not we chose the easy path. We chose the harder path. And we chose a life that is going to be harder. And all of the things that we want to do, we want to give up under trials. You can't. You gotta stay focused on the crown of life. You can't let the trials and the temptations beat you down because we have something better coming. Yep. Yeah. We got to always stay focused on Jesus. Thank you. Yep. 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 Endurance takes practice. That's right. Yeah, so the longer that you stay focused on Christ, the easier it should get. Yes. Hmm. Yep. Yeah, because I mean, even the path to eldership, they never say it's just like just get baptized and then there you are. It takes a lifelong. If you need the wisdom, you need the endurance, you need to be able to teach others and to teach your family. Give up. Yep. Yep. Temptations are tied up in all the trials that we face. So this is really good. Thank you. So now we need to be moving on to verse 13. So verse 13 through 15. No one is to say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted by evil, and he himself does not tempt anyone. But each one is tempted uh, when he is carried away and enticed by his own lust. Then, when lust has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it has run its course, brings forth death. So here we're going to be looking at what does temptation look like? Yeah, temptation comes in many forms. So, and what James is laying out for us is almost like a formula that Steve talked about. So, we're going to be going through kind of what does temptation look like? What is the formula that James is telling us? And so, this morning, I went and kind of looked into the three different, I focused on three words and went into the Greek. So, the three that I looked into were are drawn away, desires, and enticed. And so, the literal translation for these three words, drawn away, is as game is lured from its hiding place. It almost makes you think of a fish, right? As a game is lured from its hiding place, that is what drawn away means in the Greek. Desires, the direct translation is lusts. And enticed, to catch by using bait. So here he says everyone is going to be tempted when, like as they were game, being lured away from their hiding place. They're going to be, baited, and that bait is going to be their desires or their own lusts. Oh, and by the way, it happens to everyone, right? So he's like, everyone's going to go through it. No one's excluded. Everyone's going to go through it. So here are the things that we need to know about temptation. There's going to be bait. The bait is going to be attractive. And it's going to be attractive to you personally. It's going to look in different forms, and it can look different to everybody. And the goal of this bait is to move you from where you currently are. The goal is to get you drawn out. And also, it's going to happen to everyone. So when I think about it, I'm an excellent artist, as you can see. So, I think about this idea of bait. There will be bait. The bait is going to be attractive. 1 John even tells us what it's going to look like. It's going to come in different forms. It's going to be the lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, or the pride of life. And the temptation, its goal is to move you from where you currently are. Also, it's going to happen to all of us. Happens to everyone. And then like Steve said, so when lust has conceived, it gives birth to sin. So once you do that action and you're moving away from where you are and doing that action, that's when sin takes place. So a couple of things that I thought to think about this morning. If we know it's going to happen to everyone, and we know that there's a formula. We know the formula, and we know it's going to happen. So what are things that we can do to protect ourselves? What are some things that we can do to protect ourselves if we know the formula and we know that it's going to happen. How do we protect ourselves? Yep, draw closer to God. So get closer into that hiding place. Yeah, get closer into that hiding place and resist the devil. Okay, thank you. Stay out of the water, that's right. Yeah, be patient. Mm-hmm. Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. Yep. So you gotta make the lusts unattractive. Yep. Yep. Yeah. So confess your temptations to others, and also I think recognizing what is the bait to me, like recognizing what triggers me, that when that line gets out there, I have a trigger in my mind. It's like, oh, that I need to stay away from that, and recognizing what triggers me because I do not want to move. I don't want to have that force, that action of going towards the bait. So another thing that I thought about, the question was, what can we do to protect ourselves? I think one thing that we could do to protect ourselves is really study more, or just do a better job of internalizing how terrible sin is. So I think one thing in the fishing analogy, if your job was to catch fish and tag them, you throw out the line and you get them and you pull them in and you tag them number one and you throw them back out there. You fish again and you roll them back in and you pull up the fish and it's tag number one. This dumb fish, kind of throw them back out there, throw it back out, pull in another one, tag number one. It's like, what's going on? Throw it back out there. So after 4 or 5 times and you catch tag number one, what are you thinking about that fish? He either doesn't feel pain, he doesn't care, or he's just dumb. I mean, that's what I think. Keeps going after it over and over and over again. Does it not hurt? Does he not know that it hurts? Or is he just dumb? Or does he not care? So when I think about living life as a Christian, and we see that bait out there, are we dumb? Do we not care? Or do we not really know that sin is like a hook yanking us in the mouth? And if we felt that pain of sin like God and Jesus does, are we going to keep going after that bait? So I think when I think internally, I always want to focus on, I see the trigger, and I know the pain. I'm not going for the bait. I'm going to draw closer to God. I'm going to get back into the rock, and I'm just going to stay focused on living this life because I do not want to go through that pain because Jesus did it for
dumb or not start. So not a coincidence. Almost every time that I can think in my mind, calling or talk about morality, either right before that or right after that, it does say God and himself righteous.
me. Mm-hmm.
So if we as Christians are filling ourselves with righteousness, we are satisfied with Christ. And like the fish starving, fighting, water. What we do it. So fish act for like aggression, like they're saying off of their nest in the rock, or
So to summarize, if we fill ourselves on Christ, we're not hungry for the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, or the pride of life.
yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep. So we need to have wisdom to stay away from these temptations. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Yep. Thank you. So what are the things we can teach our children? We don't have enough time, but just I think teaching our children stay away from these things, the dangers of them, and also to stay encouraged. So we know that Jesus endured everything. So we have a high priest, that knows our weakness. He's tempted in all things, yet without sin. So I go back to Jesus at the wilderness, the temptations that he faced, yet he never was going for that. So he was always drawn close to the Lord, and he wasn't going to be drawn away and act on that temptation. Yep. Wear the life jacket of the word of Christ. Right. That's right. Yep. Pray that you do not enter into temptation. That's right. Yep. I think. Yep. So God doesn't expect for us to go through this alone. Thank you. All right. Thank you. This is wonderful. So I think for the next 5 minutes, is it end at 10:15? So next 5 minutes, we're going to jump down and look at verses 19. So James chapter 1, verses 19. So he says, "My dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry, because human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires. Therefore, get rid of all moral filth and evil that is so prevalent, and humble accepted the word implanted in you, which can save you." So the reason why we're going to jump down to this is just because how James started. So he says, take note of this. So if you're going to be taking notes, he's like, get out your pencils. It's time to pay attention. Write this down. Don't forget about it. Take note of this. These are things that I want you to know. This is going to be really, really, really important. Everyone needs to be quick to listen. So we need to be in a hurry to listen, in a hurry to hear. And after that, then we need to, after you've been quick to listen, then you need to be slow to speak. And even further than that, slower yet to anger. So one thing that I remember, if you all remember, Lawrence Kelly came and did a series about a marriage series, and he specifically talked about this passage in particular, and he said, when we come in conflict with anyone, members of the church or your spouse or anyone, how much use comes out of a conversation when people are angry? When people are angry, they care more about powering themselves up and bolding over the other person. I care more about what I'm going to say to make sure that I am right over you. And that's not what this says. It says whenever conflict is coming up, that you are rushing to hear what the other person thinks. And that you, after that, are slow to speak, but even slower yet to being angry. So that when you do, human anger doesn't produce the rightness of God. So that word righteousness is really the rightness of God. And so whenever we do these things, it's not about us coming up and taking our ideas over brothers and sisters or our spouse, but more about us being right with each other. And that when we're having these conversations, it's about coming together and being right with your fellow Christians and not necessarily being over them in an argument of rightness. So that was just the last thing that we wanted to talk about this morning. I appreciate all of the comments and the feedback this morning. It's been a good class. So thank you all. I appreciate it.